Now, I recently read a book by Stanford professors Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, and they wrote this: designers imagine things that do not exist currently, which they build, and the world changes. Designers believe in radical collaboration, which works on the principle that people with very different backgrounds will bring their idiosyncratic technical and human experiences to the team. Now, doesn't that sound like two Stanford professors wrote that?
Yeah.
This increases the chances that the team will have empathy for all those who will be using what they're designing, and that the collaboration of different backgrounds will generate truly unique and highly efficient solutions. Now, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want that? Nothing is perfect, but designers make things better. So let's meet one now. My guest today is Raja Schaar, and she is an industrial designer with an extensive background in museum exhibit design. She's very passionate about ways design can make positive impact intersections with health, with the environment, and with education. She's an associate program director and an assistant professor of product design at Drexel University's Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design. She also, in her spare time, co-chairs the IDSA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. Raja, welcome to Life Altering Events.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Frank. It's nice to be here. And thanks for that lovely introduction. I really resonated with the quote that you just mentioned about this idea of radical collaboration and working with people from different backgrounds. And I think the main thing that I originally loved about design was its ability to sort of create from nothing. And that to me is sort of like magical. It's like this superpower. And as a kid, you're always like coming up with like new inventions or ideas. And I always was wondering like, who's responsible? Who's the they behind all the cool things I get to play with? And once I discovered industrial design, it was just everything connected and synced up.
So was there an aha moment growing up where you said, or in school, you said, I need to do this? And then you found out there's actually a curriculum for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a few ahas. I am a lifelong complainer about things that don't work. So it wasn't even about the creating so much as the why do they do it like this? So one of the stories I like to tell was I used to play with the Fisher Price Little People, the 80s version, not I guess the newer version, which are a little bit chubbier and cuter. And there was like a house that closed up. It had like a roof on it. And the house was mostly like some sort of like press board. And then the roof itself was like plastic and it had a handle on it. And they would take it everywhere, outside, inside. And I grew up in South Georgia, and we had a lot of insects, mosquitoes, etc. And I remember we had this, maybe it was like a DEET-based insect repellent, and some of it dripped onto the roof of the house, and the shingles started to melt together. And I was furious, like not just because it marred my thing, so it like permanently sort of like dissolved and melted the plastic, but the main issue I had with it was, who would design this toy knowing that kids play outside and have to use insect repellent, and design it such that I cannot have any insect repellent on my hands or nearby, otherwise I will destroy my toy. And the disconnect between thinking about all the scenarios that might be involved in play or use of a product or object was, I think, from that moment cemented there. I think there's like the Far Side cartoon where it's like the school for the gifted and the kid is pushing instead of pulling, even though the door says pull. But there's this logical way that we interact with objects that someone understands, and some things work well for that. And then some things are just poorly designed, and we're constantly sort of butting heads against it. And oftentimes it comes down to us thinking that we are somehow messing up as the user. But really, it's a design flaw. And so there was this sort of invisible box behind the pathway and history of these products that I was sort of fascinated with. And then I watched the movie Big with Tom Hanks.
Right.
Um, And everyone remembers there's a scene where he's at FAO Schwartz, or the version, what I forget, I think it was actually a different name of a company in the movie. But he was hired as a toy executive, as like the VP of product development. And the way the story goes is, he's a 13-year-old kid. He makes a wish on Zoltar, this sort of like wishing kiosk, and he wakes up as an adult. And then he has to run off to the city, and he's a kid, so he decides he wants to try to find a job so he can make money. And he ends up working at a toy company, and he works his way up from the mailroom into the boardroom pretty quickly because he so intuitively understands kids. But there's like this scene where he's playing on like this huge, large scale piano, and everybody remembers that scene. But I
Yes.
remember a different scene, and it was a scene where they were pitching these like new like buildable toys. It was kind of like a transformer.
Right.
It's like a toy robot, and he's complaining that the guy's pitch is like, no kid's gonna play with that, and so pitches this other one, which ends up being like a big hit, and everybody thinks he's a genius, but of course he is because he has a kid. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's the kind of like intuition that it really takes in order to be able to design toys well, right? You have to be someone who's connected to your child's side in order to be able to design products. And then there's another scene in there where you were walking through the halls, and just for a split second, there's this woman, I'm imagining she's like from market research, who's running with a horde of kids down the hall into this room where they are using or they're going to go play and test toys and like see how well they hold up. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's like also someone there to like actually understand, talk to, observe, and get feedback from the users of these products. So there's like this idea of toys failing. There's this behind the scenes look at how toys sort of come to be. There's this understanding of like your own intuition that kind of goes into it. And then there's this reliance or use of sort of like user market research to inform like what
Mhm.
you do and how you do it. And so that sort of revealed to me that there was this thing I wanted to do. They never used the word industrial design at all in
Right.
that. So I didn't know it was called industrial design. So I looked for it everywhere. I kind of landed on engineering as a path because engineers make stuff. And so I started school as an engineer, and then very quickly within my first year of school discovered industrial design was a major. I went to Georgia Tech for my undergrad, and then decided to follow a path along industrial design, and eventually into exhibition design. And then now I'm associate professor at Drexel, and I teach design across all spectrums, industrial design, and been doing that for about 20 years now. And a lot of interaction design, a lot of focus on sustainability and ethical design and responsible design. And then trying to bring that same curiosity about design to other young Black girls through some of my research, trying to diversify the field. So I have
Right.
a co-founded a program with 4 other faculty here at Drexel University, Ayana Allen Handy, Michelle Rogers, and Valerie Eiffel, and it's called Black Girls Steaming Through Dance. And our whole thing is trying to understand the superpower that creating what's next in technology and design is something that is available to everybody, and how do you get attracted to it. And usually relying on sort of some sort of cultural connection is a really great way to attract people to fields. So we use dance as sort of like the entry point for STEAM, and teach them how to make wearable electronics and code VR environments. They've been messing around a little bit with some AI, but it's a really fun way for me to sort of capture that curiosity and imagination that I had as a kid with kids that are around the same age. They're kind of discovering these tools and trying to make sense of what that actually is in the world, what sort of pathways are optional to follow, and how to have fun with making stuff.
Now, STEAM is an extension of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. So the A is art. Is that correct?
Yes. I like to think of design as just STEAM. There's another way to spell design.
Right.
So, the idea of creativity being at the core of it, and creativity in all areas of the arts, which is sort of innate, but you, science without the art doesn't really translate to anyone. And I think the same thing with engineering without creativity is just, mechanics. So really that arts are sort of integral to the way most people work in terms of either applying it or process. And then design being one of those areas that sort of brings together sort of understanding people, so the psychology. You have to kind of understand the engineering and technology that goes into making products work or being able to produce them or manufacture them. And then there's also sort of like this business side of it as well that kind of comes into play. So design is sort of inclusive of a lot of things. And that's another thing that really attracted me to the field is it doesn't ask you to ignore any one part of your experience or identity. In fact, it always is asking you to add more to
Mhm.
understand how things interact with other things, those intersections.
One of the things we spoke about is that you said we have to start thinking of integration between disciplines and between different types of programs, that designers should be involved in the early stages. It was a long range view, I think was the term you
Yes.
used. What are some
Yes.
examples that you've seen that you think would make a lot of sense?
Well, I mean, one of the things I think, design is macro and micro. I like to think about design as a process versus design as an object. So there's this idea of designing as a process, but then there's like the things that you produce. And at the macro scale, we're thinking about things like policy, maybe cities, maybe governments, countries,
Mhm.
curriculum, right? Pedagogies. And it's really this intentional understanding of how to organize these things, how to deploy and produce them, that's super critical. And when we think about design at the micro scale, and let's go down to the scale of like maybe my profession, which is like looking at the scale of the object or this, and even then those objects exist within a system. Oftentimes designers will get handed a brief where it's like, I would like to have a widget. And let's make up the widget. The widget's a cup. So that's the product scale object at sort of a micro, it's the thing. If we only focus on designing the cup as it's been told to us by some boardroom executive, a client, whatever, we ignore the rest of the system and we also ignore the history of it, right? So what happens if we design a cup just like the other one was made and it's just as much of a failure economically as well as functionally and ergonomically and material wise and all the things? We haven't really taken in consideration like all those things. And a lot of engineers, and not to give any poo-poo of engineering, I think engineers are great, but engineers as a subset of design are very much focused on the product. They will make whatever you tell them, and they will make it work. So it will work as a cup, it will be fine. But a designer, an industrial designer, well, before you make the cup, they want to make sure that you're making the right cup. So they have to back up. So, you're backing up in terms of the product development process, but not just to understand sort of the history of cups, but also to understand like what is the intent of the cup, like who is going to be using it, what is it going to be used for, how long is it going to be used for, what happens to it at the end of life, how is it cleaned. So you're kind of looking at the object at that immediate sort of like frame of that product system. How does it fit into cabinets? How does it fit into other cups? How does it fit into backpacks, cars? What kind of temperature does it hold? What's the volume of it, right? So we're thinking about these features and we're thinking about the experience of it. But if you back it up even more, and this is where I think this like even long range or just wider lens or this systemic view, we have to think about what the cup sort of holds in terms of like its role in our environment as well. So a disposable single-use cup that you might be able to pick up at a fast food restaurant might function well, might hold its volume, might keep your hands from burning, might deploy in a way that's like hits your lips perfectly. It keeps it from spilling, fits in your car, it does all these things. Maybe it's slightly reusable or only usable for a certain amount of time. But if we look at it long range, what we can start to understand is this cup is made out of materials, and those materials were somehow extracted and manufactured and put together and eventually made into this cup. And every person that touched any part of that process, on the social side, on the working side, is also impacted by the production of that cup. So whether or not it was something that empowered them economically and they had a job based on it,
Mhm.
whether it's the person that transported it, whether they're the person that manufactured and put it together, whether they're the person who cut down the trees in which let's say it's a paper cup in this case, the the lumber was turned into paper pulp, which is eventually, coated and folded and put into this cup form and then stacked together and transported. All of those different parts of the system, we often look back on to figure out like how we want to make our thing. But then there's also this after use thing where once we're done with the cup, what happens to it? And if you're looking at it again systemically and you're looking at the intersection of the micro with the macro, at the scale of the city, you can walk down any urban environment and probably very many suburban and rural ones and probably see some trash. And you might
Yep,
see a disposable cup laying on the side of the road, right?
that's right.
So this idea of it, where does it go when I'm done with it? If it's, especially if it's designed to be single use, means that we have to be like thinking about the afterlife, and that can lead to things like environmental pollution. And if you have places that don't have really strong infrastructure, again, a design decision, and maybe great sanitation support, you might see more and more litter, more and more of this things being disposed. And if you think about it in the real world, oftentimes we see levels of pollution like this in populations or places that are low income, frequently, especially in the United States, and people of color, etc. So we're making a cup, and we are very proud of our cup. And designers want to say that the object is beautiful, and it may look really great and hit all marks, but someone else might question why this cup needs to exist. Why does it exist the way that it does? Why does it need to be single use? If it is single use, it is intended to be disposed of. Can we design a system in which like recapture of those materials or disposing of those materials is responsible? Can we make sure that the cups that we're making that are serving low income people that maybe are not inferior to those that are serving high income people? So there's this idea of equity in the use of an object, which also extends itself even beyond just thinking about sort of the system of like from like, I guess, constituent material or from the earth back to the earth again, where they say cradle to cradle, but also thinking about accessibility. So who can actually use that cup as it's
Right.
designed? So, and then, what other ways can we accomplish the same goal without it having to be a cup? Does the cup even need to exist? So there's like this philosophical thing that goes there, and designers ask those questions early. So go back to your question. An engineer is going to make your cup. A designer is going to be equipped to wrestle with that human element, with this sort of environmental and systems view element, and also be able to create and craft something that will be beautiful and function well. And hopefully be able to ask good questions so that once it's time to deploy that out into the marketplace, we can do so in a responsible way, one that's inclusive of the values of the company as well as the values of people, but also, something that a designer can hopefully be proud of.
Exactly. Now, sometimes designers come in after the fact. An example, when we spoke a few weeks ago, you said chocolate. Everybody loves chocolate,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the manufacturing of chocolate has some issues.
Yes.
Explain that.
So, chocolate, first of all, thank you for saying everybody loves chocolate. I mean, it's one of my favorite things. And I think it's chocolate in and of itself as a product is really complex only because we think again about the source of these things. Like, where does it go? It's not so much the chocolate in your mouth. I don't think anybody would disagree. There's maybe 10 people in the world who don't enjoy chocolate in some form.
Right.
So let's just talk about like chocolate as it is. But chocolate, the plant, comes from regions around the globe that are frequently in the global south that are poor.
Exactly.
Right. And so when we are extracting some of the resources in from the cocoa plant in order to be able to produce this chocolate, we often are not thinking about sort of the integrity of how that's produced. So you have these larger manufacturers who produce chocolate goods. I won't name names, but the Cocos of the world, the instant chocolates, the milk chocolate bars, that are using chocolate that may have been sourced from places where it's causing a lot more outfall than just the harvesting of the materials, where we're looking at the pay of people, we're looking at slave labor and sometimes enforced labor. We're looking at trafficking. We're also looking at other sort of environmental impacts that don't aren't communicated to people, especially here in the US, when they're walking into their local Wawa, or Wawa is a local food chain, like convenience store that's here in
Right.
Philadelphia, and buying a chocolate bar for $1.50 or $2. So the source of those kinds of materials is something that we also think about with even other products. So for instance, our rechargeable electronics, your phone, your car, your I have an electric car, your computer, tablet, literally almost everything these days is also being produced or being powered by things that are coming from areas of the globe that are often not talked about. So like Congo, for instance, is seeing like large scale, sort of like massive sort of genocide, as well as other sort of political turmoil, but it's often related to extractive colonialism, which we think about as pulling resources from a
Right.
place in order to give it to somebody else,
Somebody
right?
else. Exactly.
Somebody else gets to use it, not the people there, but the people there are responsible for pulling these materials from the earth. And so, and then the benefits are not benefiting everyone, but in fact, severely harming some people that are in this sort of ecosystem of producing things. But we produce those electronics, like for instance, the electric car, under the auspices of being more responsible, right? We want to
Cut down on the
the
carbon
environment,
footprint.
right?
Right.
But at what cost, right? And that's sort of like the far-reaching and sort of like global impact of decisions that we make every day as consumers of goods. Any good that is somehow physically used, manufactured, or is powered off of resources has to be thought of. And I think that so many designers, and this is something that's been sort of a passion of mine, aren't really encouraged or taught to think about like where things come from, and not that just things come from other places, but where is the harm in the process, who benefits, who suffers, and who is impacted, positive and negatively, and is that impact equitable, and is it fair really to everyone involved all along the cycle.
Right. Exactly. We spoke about, I have a place in Phoenix and I spend a great deal of time there. It's very hot in Phoenix. And as they were designing certain areas to live, and usually the lower income levels, high rises, bigger, more buildings, cement, concrete, not a lot of green spaces.
Mhm.
People are dying. There's simply
From
now
the heat, from the
from
heat.
the heat, from the heat. Now they are going back and attempting to re-engineer, redesign, right? So in a situation like that, when they call someone like you in, what do? The stuff is there, and they're going to say, "We can't afford to redo this."
But then the question is, if you don't do it, can you afford the consequences? And that's something
Perfect.
I don't think, and this is something you know, and I don't have the exact, statistic or quote, but I read a couple of months ago, maybe it's a couple of years ago at this point, that humans have a lot of difficulty actually thinking about the future. Like we are almost unable to do it. Really, like in the abstract, we can kind of think like, oh, I kind of want to go on vacation next year, but planning more than like 2 weeks out, like cognitively, is just so difficult to do because our brain as a computer is thinking about all these different variables and possibilities, and there's infinite possibilities. What if this? What if that? What if this? Right? So it's really more comfortable for us to think about the immediate future. And so when we're doing that as people, oftentimes that translates to how we operate in business too. So like corporations, governments, et cetera. And you see a lot of like businesses, corporations, especially those that produce products, that are thinking about quarterly, timelines. So what
Yes.
are we going to be doing this quarter? What are we going to do in next quarter? What are we projecting 3 months out? So we're talking about, not very long at all in terms of like the grand scheme of things. But then if you're looking at places like governments are looking at how they're planning out cities, right? So the city planning and places that don't take into consideration the need for green infrastructure, the timeline it takes to grow trees, establish screens, establish a canopy that actually can shade and shield and provide more, the filter the air, air pollution, thinking about that. If we're not thinking about that when we're setting out the thing, then it's all retroactive, right? It's all going backwards and trying to put a band-aid on a solution. And the problem is it's hard to fix things once they're established. Once the cat is out of the bag, horse out of the barn, whatever it is,
Yes.
you can't put it back in. So then we're creating more design solutions, which are just complicating things. And I just want to, also say that design is not perfect. Design tries to solve problems, but everything that we produce, there's a trade-off. So when we fix one thing, we're creating other problems somewhere else that also has to be addressed or fixed or considered. So it's very complicated. So bandaging things in retrospect would mean we would probably be digging up some of this concrete. Where does it go?
We're back to the question
Yeah.
again.
Right. And so then we put the trees in and we have to wait for them to grow. But while we're waiting for them to grow, what do we do in the meantime? Right. So we're always trying to mitigate our own mistakes that we're making, as opposed to the careful sort of like future planning. And so I think, training designers, and I think there's people in this planet, maybe it's a part of their career paths or just because they're innate, whatever, who are comfortable wrestling with the unknowns, who are comfortable wrestling with the possibilities, or think about your meteorologist, your friendly, they're okay crunching these numbers, and maybe it's math driven, maybe it's intuition driven. Somehow or another, there's this idea of there's a possible negative or positive consequence to everything that we're doing. And I'm okay thinking about that. Designers aren't necessarily always those people, but many designers are. And there's a subset of people that are futurists, and they're in every discipline, whether they're in the military, in fiction, in design. But these sort of like futurists, and I consider myself to be one, aren't necessarily soothsayers or prophets, but they really are paying attention to first of all, historical evidence, what has happened before when we've done this. They ask really great questions. And they ask the question, most importantly, what if? What if we did this and it went wrong? What would have caused that? What if we do this and there's going to be a lawsuit? Why would people be suing? What if we do this and people die?
Yeah.
Will we address it in the aftermath, or will we try to prevent it? Right? People that work for insurance companies, actuaries who can tell you, statistically, what the likelihood of something is going to be. So I do think that this idea of not featuring, like when you're thinking about, Phoenix in particular, is something that we're so comfortable with not doing because it's hard to do. And even in schools, it's all about the test you're taking next week. It's all about the class you need to graduate, for next year. It's all about the college you're going to go to after high school. But it's never, and we always say, what do you want to be when you grow up? But we don't really mean that. We really mean, what are you going to be in the next 3 or 4 years next time I see you? So it's really, really difficult to do. And I don't think people are prepared to slow down enough to wrestle with some of these things. So they're making more cautious and hopefully more equitable decisions for everyone. And then not just thinking about quarterly returns, but thinking about the cost of not acting appropriately, not slowing it down. And I think that's the thing, that if you were putting out 10 years instead of 3 months, then you might actually see where that happens. And I trying to remember, I just saw like an example, maybe it was like 2 days ago, that someone was talking about a lawsuit that was happening. And oh no, I remember now. It was Dave Campbell, I guess, a guitarist, and then maybe there's like a case study about this. He was on a United Airline flight, and then someone said, "Oh, I see them throwing like guitars, out there," and it was like baggage handlers were apparently like chucking things, and so had broken his guitar. So he went and talked to the folks at United. They ignored him. So he wrote a viral song about it, and they lost like millions of dollars. So they could have replaced his guitar, and they could have actually done the right thing then. But the consequence of that long range was, a plummet in stock prices, like losses of millions, and the idea of thinking just a few weeks out, like what could possibly happen, right?
Right.
is so critical. And I don't think that people understand the cost of not doing the right thing. It's cheaper in the
It
immediate,
is.
but never long term. And if we think about poor health outcomes, talking about people dying, um, like the cost of those to those individual families, to like, you know, the health impacts of that and caring for that, the sort of the stress on the healthcare system, the stress on just like the grid in terms of like infrastructure, um, like the consequences of it are dire, as opposed to, you know, spending a few $100,000 to put some trees in at this outset could have prevented
Right.
all, right?
We had, we spoke about Dr. Edward Hess, and I interviewed him. He's a futurist at the Darden School at the University of Virginia. And he told me 65% of children entering kindergarten today are going to work in a job or a career that does not exist. Now, is this a good opportunity to start incorporating design very early into the education system? Does this make sense?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I feel like I'm one of those people who came of age. I was in the college in the late 90s, so like during the dot-com bubble burst. So I actually, I mean, I paid my since I paid my way through college, but I made extra money making websites. Like no one had done it before, really. They were
Right.
like, how hard could it be? You know, well, you can learn HTML or CSS or whatever, you know. So you kind of like teaching yourself at a place where there was no one to teach you, because it was one of those areas that was emerging where design was intersecting with technology in such a way that it needed to be usable. So it wasn't so much about just coding and computer science to get computers on the computer engineering side, but it really was starting to look at more like the human-centered side of it. And I think the same thing is happening even now as we're watching AI sort of boom. There's AI as the technology, there's this idea of you can write an algorithm that can take some information and spit out what you want faster than you can probably do it on your own. And even through like different versions, eventually get to what you were thinking about faster than you would be able to retype it, right? So this idea of prompt engineering. So we know we can get the technology to behave in the manner just described just now, but we don't know is, and this is what people have been a lot of times wrestling with, is like the ethics of this, like sort of like the systems view of this, the long range view of this. And so when we think about the design, not just as like being able to create something, but being able to understand how to navigate a process, to critique and ask really compelling questions about how a tool is used instead of falling in love with the technology itself, then suddenly you have a much more savvy, a much more critically in tune, like individual. And that's someone who's also creative and also is able to execute on their visions, right? So they can execute when needed. They know how to navigate different parts of like making and creating. They know how to ask really great questions about technology. And so what we're really talking about is sort of a design literacy that and I know that design for most people is going to be the object. They're going to think about design as a poster, design as a logo, design as
Right.
an iPhone, but design like a, you know, the little d, I guess the word of it is really just process. It's really a strategic process that we're applying. So being able to get little kids, elementary school kids, and I had the pleasure of being able to see them do this. Identify as a designer, but also think strategically about things and being able to wrestle with possibilities, ask questions about what if, and I hate to use a word like failure, but understanding that the iteration and trying things out is part of that development cycle. And so they get comfortable with this idea of experimentation, but also understanding how to design for different scenarios, different contexts, different tools, different needs, and also understand that it's not like a blueprint where we're just applying it every single time. There's like a nuance and subtlety to it. And I feel like most elementary school kids, I know, I don't know if kindergarten is too young, but already kind of do that. It's
Yeah,
play,
it
right?
is.
They ask questions, they try things out. They take a toy from this set and try to shove it onto this set. They take toys and try to shove it into electrical outlets, right? They're kind of seeing what lands, what hits. And eventually they always figure out how to solve their own problems, which I think is really great. So you have these innate problem solvers who are highly curious, highly motivated, always asking why. they also have a really great sense of like what's fair and what's not fair, what's right, what's wrong, what's good in the world. They're not, jaded by money yet. So, why not kids? I think
Exactly.
kids are the future.
Exactly. I did a talk with a group of second grade teachers, and they said we're still having a lot of COVID related social and emotional issues. So they're doing a big thing with SEL, social emotional learning.
Mm-hmm.
And she said to me, one of them said to me, I'm seeing, they don't understand it, but I'm seeing critical thinking occurring. I'm seeing collaboration because they're willing to work with each other. I'm seeing they don't care where you came from. They don't care. They just want to get it something completed and they're enjoying it. And that's the magic. Is I've worked in corporate America for 35 years and most people did not enjoy what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
They would
And
just say, do this.
yeah, I think, is it a job or is it like I don't know. So like jobs are jobs, right? You can be a
Yeah,
designer and you can work in a million different places, and some places you will enjoy and you won't enjoy. But like being able to find something about your chosen career or position or job or whatever it is that you enjoy, and even if it's about the how you're doing it with someone else, it doesn't matter where we're going as long as we go together, right?
exactly.
um Maybe it's about the media, maybe you really like doing something with that particular technology or paint or fabric, right? Maybe it really is about solving a problem out in the world. Maybe it is about the industry that you work in. So I often talk to students who really are passionate about healthcare. They don't really care how they apply design towards it, whether it's a digital product, a prosthetic,
Mhm.
as a strategist for a hospital system. But they really, the thing they want to be involved in is making people well and making people better and improving the healthcare system so that it, addresses needs. So, you can do that as a cancer doctor, as an oncologist, or you can really do that, from any level. And so those kinds of passions or those loves that energize people and bring joy to what you're doing, I think can transcend a job title or can transcend a company, because let's face it, we're, especially in America, there are a lot of toxic workplaces or even just toxic practices in really strong and really well run workplaces. And sometimes it's about work life balance, sometimes it's other things. And for a lot of designers, especially like for me, for in particular, if you're a woman of color, then, there are probably other things about working, especially in corporate America, that makes it challenging. But I do think there's often ways that you can find some moment of joy. And I feel like I've been able to do that here, even in academia, as not that it's corporate, but kind of is. Um,
And yeah, it kind of is.
right. So like being able to not only do something that I am passionate about, and I would be a designer and I've designed no matter where I've been, but being able to find like my group of people that really make this work meaningful. So like the faculty members that I mentioned before for my Black Girls Steaming Through Dance project. And then I also have one of my colleagues that we met the very first day, we both were hired back in 2016 at the campus convocation. Um, and we've been working together passionately since, really focusing on this climate intersection with design, intersection with ethics, and how we can really try to work to transform the mindsets of some of these designers, and how we are doing that with our sort of experiments that we're doing in our classroom, but also how we can scale that outside. So we've had an opportunity to collaborate with faculty from like James Madison University and like Elon University on that project, which has been really wonderful. And it's like I would work with Chris Baeza. I would work with her no matter where it was. So if I was at Drexel, not at Drexel, whatever, because the work that we're doing is not about Drexel. It's not about even our industries only. It really is about like this mindset shift that we think just needs to happen for designers anywhere, whether they're in school or out in the world. And how do people wrestle with sort of like the impact of what they're doing, especially when they don't have a lot of control over it because they have to be able to pay their mortgage or send their kids to school or put groceries on the table. So you're going to be out in the world working as a designer. You're going to be working for companies that may be responsible for some of the, fallout in the environment and in society. How can you make decisions about what you're doing that resonate with your own personal virtues and ethics, but also acknowledges the consequences of action, but still doesn't sort of challenge your sense of sort of duty? So like using sort of a normative ethics framework to really critique design and critique what we do, and then also allow us to figure out how to not beat ourselves up over decisions that we are sometimes forced to make, but giving vocabulary to those feelings of dissonance that we can then hopefully communicate to our higher ups or companies to try to slow it down,
Exactly.
slow things down,
Exactly.
and bring that sort of like cautious optimism to design as opposed to the optimism bias where it'll work out eventually, but that won't be
Yes.
my problem, right?
Yeah, I won't be in that job that long. So it's the next guy's problem. I saw that in corporate America all the time. You're only going to be in your CEO position for 3 to 5 years. Don't do anything stupid. You walk out with a nice parachute,
Yeah.
right? It's crazy. After you and I spoke, and I looked at Dr. Hess's comments, and I said, let's just take a look. If you don't adjust corporate America, if you corporate anywhere, if you don't adjust, you may not be here. So I went back and I looked, 1975, top 4 Fortune companies, 1975, ExxonMobil, General Motors, Ford, Texaco. Okay, that was it. They were it. Today, 2014, Walmart, Amazon, ExxonMobil's still there, and Apple. 3 of the 4 weren't even in the top
Yeah.
100. The evolution is coming, and progressive leaders, and what I love about what you're doing is taking this design level of thinking and putting it into the next level coming up, because they're the people who are going to have to make these decisions,
Yeah.
right? Because a lot of the stuff is there and it's bad, and it's got to be adjusted, and then it's a decision: am I going to make the right decision going forward? And I worked for a big high tech corporation, and one of the things that they were afraid of is, well, we need to retool. Ford and General Motors are great examples, but we can't afford to retool because we're going to miss the quarterly number and the stock people are going to kill us. So they sat on their hands. And Kia and Honda and Toyota and everyone else said, well, we're not sitting on our hands. And they moved out, and then they made the adjustments. Now you're in catch up mode. Now, wouldn't it be nice that you're teaching people like you are to think about that in advance? You know what, and to bring in and to stop just listening to the financial analysts. Let's talk
Yeah.
to the people that are impacted, the user, like you did with the children, having them come in. What do you think? The big was a great example when he was, well, why would a kid, this is not any fun. Or when he said to the other guy who put a thing up there, he goes, I don't understand,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Like that idea of having, and I think that goes also to thinking about who's in the room, right? That diversity in the room. So the other thing is, there's a lot of pressure on companies to get things right. And there's a lot of pressure on a CEO to get things right, or they're held responsible when things go wrong. And my thing is, if we stop thinking about it as a single person's job, and we think about this sort of collective vision that a team can contribute to, if you have a diverse, qualified, energetic, enthusiastic, creative, and critical team in that room from all walks of life, from all ages, races, backgrounds, economic status, geographic locations, collectively, everyone there has this mega brain. And it's like my trivia team. I have a trivia team. That if you don't know, someone there is going to know. If you didn't think to ask the question, that's okay. Someone else has already been thinking about it. And I think that just sort of hits to like the need for a lot more inclusion and diversity, and also empowering those voices so that it's not the CEO's voice who wins, but it's the careful listening of like those kinds of nuanced concerns that really arise from like the diverse positionality of a team of people that
Right.
would be able to ask, well, I happen to see that we should do this, or this is another way we could prepare for that. It's also like figuring out how to bake in the flex of this, like the diversity of the team is like baking in that flexibility that you're talking about, kind of planning for things to go wrong or planning for moments of pause. It doesn't have to take another pandemic to make people, I mean, and that, I think so many companies actually were able to really retool during that shutdown, right?
Yes, it did.
And you see like, okay, let's talk about China as a powerhouse. Like they, whether or not we want them making every single product that we have in America, they make the majority of products that we use in America, and they still shut down for a month a year to celebrate the Chinese New Year, right?
Hmm.
And the other 11 months of the year, yes, highly productive, no doubt, right? But but they build in a moment of pause there that doesn't really seem to negatively impact anybody. So we can see that we have the ability to pivot when required, but unless there's like some dire circumstance, it seems with like American capitalism, we think that if we stop, we'll die. But then you see like these smaller shops, and maybe they're the mom and pops and like freelance folks or folks that have their independent firms that will schedule it in. Like, oh, there's a French bakery around the corner from my gym, and for years, I think they were there in that location for 17 years. Every February, they closed. They went to France. Every March, they had a thing. We'll be back on whatever day. There was a line waiting for them to get back.
And they got back.
People are allowed to take breaks and to pause. But I mean, if you look at sort of like the Google model or Alphabet, and I don't know if they still do this, but they used to have like, they built in sort of like skunk works
Yeah,
as part of like the way that they operated. And so Fridays was a day that you still had to come to work, but you could work on whatever you wanted to independently. And because they built in this sort of like rest time where it wasn't about the business of Google or Alphabet, and forget if they were still Google or Alphabet at the time they were doing this, but the stuff that people were kind of working on, these side projects, so many of those products have shown up in the cloud-based systems that we use today, the AI tools that have been developed here and there, image editing software, other hardware companies. The Skunk Works, this Fridays off but on, allowed Google to really invest in R&D without really
investing.
carving out a whole budget for R&D. It was just baked
Yep,
into the salaries of people, right? And
yep,
they, I mean, maybe they're not in the short list of companies you just listed. They're pretty high up there, right? People are still looking at Google, and no one's
yep.
complaining about their income. Like I can't think of anybody who works for Google who's ever complained about their salary. And they have an enormous global team that they pay really well to
Do.
do this, because they know that investing in the worker means that that worker will probably stay longer and take their job more seriously. And and they were notorious for having like the slides in the offices and like foosball and like feeding people. And yes, it was to get people to stay at work for forever. But honestly, if you're treated really well at work, you probably are going to perform at a higher level. So being treated well and being on an inclusive team and having baked in time to really like think about things that resonate with like your personal ethos and your passions, I think makes a job much more, I don't know, reasonable, but also hopefully more meaningful for a lot of people.
Exactly. And as it starts moving up the ladder, one of the things Dr. Hess told me was managers as we know them today are going to be obsolete very quickly. If you're not an enabler, if
Mm.
you're not a facilitator, which is basically design, correct? You're
Yes.
not going to survive. It is just, there's no reason to sit in the corner and everybody's sitting in front of you in a cubicle. Those days are over. I mean, COVID, horrible as it was, showed us you don't have to physically be able to see that to be able to get tremendous stuff done. And when I was my tech world, I used to deal with Intuit, and they have more patents than anybody. Same thing. Go off and do what you want to do. You got so much time every month to go do this, and they get the patent, and Intuit would actually put the patent in the individual's name.
Wow, that's amazing.
So why would you not want to stay there? They're opening up so many doors. Wow, this is amazing. This is incredible. We are just about out of time. What last words, what last thoughts you want to leave with the listeners around the world today?
Well, I guess there's a quote that I always think of, and whenever I do talks, like anywhere, And Octavia Butler is like an Afrofuturist science fiction writer, passed away, I want to say, I don't know, maybe it was like 20 years ago, but she wrote a couple of books, mini books, but she wrote this two-parter, the parable of the sower and the parable of the talents. And it was supposed to be a third part, but then she passed away, but it was written back in the 90s. And some of the stuff that's in that book, I feel like is terms of like, futurist that arc, a little bit prophetic. Really resonate with what's happening in the world today. And it's one of those, especially the parable of the sower, if you haven't read it, the first couple of chapters, it feels like you're reading in the social media feed or the news feed, like here. And it's actually set in 2024, an election year. I want to say one of the candidates' names rhymes with I mean, like Donald Trump being a candidate, I want to say his name is Drumpf or something like that, if I can remember correctly. It's like some of the things that are happening in there are so uncanny. She gets like our opioid pandemic, she gets pandemics, she gets increased extreme weather and fires. This idea of climate migration is happening there. But the main takeaway from the book is this reimagining of sort of empathy and sort of collective wisdom and community, like in the fallout and the aftermath of like some sort of like I wouldn't say apocalypse, but like, this end of the world scenario, right? The world is ending and everybody in the world is suffering. And now it's this suffering has come to the United States, and we, police injustice, all these things. What happens if your home, your world collapses, burns, whatever? Where do you go? Who do you go with? How do you get where you're going? How do you feel safe with those people? But one of the protagonists in this particular book, Lauren, is at the beginning of it is really wrestling with her own sort of personal ideology as it relates to religion and God, et cetera. I know. So she's like thinking about her parents and how they're like dealing with what's happening in the world. And, one is based using sort of a religion as sort of like this beacon, and another is not. And so she's sort of like this agnostic who's trying to make sense of the world. And she comes up with this, her own, I don't want to call it religion, but it is kind of a religion. It is originally, it's a religion with one follower, it's her. And she's like, I don't know if God exists, but I do know that change exists. So there's this beautiful quote in the book. And it's in the Earth Seed, which is what she's writing. And it's called, it's about change. I'm trying to get the quote right. I'm making sure. Everything you touch, you change. Everything that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And something about that quote, I mean, I think people have quoted it, many times, like really resonates with me when I think about like the role of design and the role of like community and the role of like people, is this idea of designers are here to change things on earth. Like we're creating and making things, right? But there's this feedback loop. Everything that we change will change us, like it inspires us. The only lasting truth is something is going to change based on what we do. And then this idea of a long lasting truth that is indisputable as change. So if God is represented by anything, it's this idea of evolution and change, and like the world of time is going to keep happening. And so I think about that in terms of like, who I am in community with, who I'm collaborating with, who I communicate with, what I do, decisions that I make in the everyday, like products that I use, things that I'm designing, how I'm teaching, but I'm also being changed by all those things. And so I just, maybe like your listeners can start to think about not just like design, but this idea of change itself as being something that's like immutable. Like it's just, that is what the world
Going to
is,
happen. It's
right?
going to
And you got to
happen.
prepare for it, right? You have to
Exactly.
acknowledge it. And it's okay. Like the world is going to be changing. Are you ready for it? And have you thought about those changes and what they might be? But also, are you growing along with those changes? And are you changing when you need to, in order to address the world to come? But mostly, I just think I want your listeners to think about how decisions that they make and actions that they take can be more thoughtful. so that those changes can be for the better and hopefully create a more just, lasting world for everyone.
Outstanding. How do people get a hold of you?
Oh, well, they can email me. My email address is my first name dot my last name at gmail.com.
Mhm.
Um, so you're welcome to reach out. I am at Drexel University, so if you're ever in Philadelphia, give me a holler. I'd be
Okay.
happy to chat with anybody at any time about pretty much anything. So,
And she's very good at this. And if you get a hold of her, she will respond very, very quickly. She's amazing, as you've heard for the last almost hour here. But we're just about out of time. Once again, I want to thank Raja Schaar again for showing us that nothing is perfect, but designers strive to show us how we can make things better because change is going to happen. So let's get out ahead of it. Now, you can see this show on my podcast called Life Altering Events. It's also on my YouTube channel, which is called Frank Sakari. It'll be on Parade Deck, and I will send links to Raja, and she will put it wherever it is she puts things in her world. If you use the YouTube channel, please subscribe. And let me leave you with this, as I do every week. None of us are in this alone, and the secret to walking on water is to know where the rocks are. And today, Raja showed us where many, many of those rocks are. Join me again next week. We go into another life altering again. Again, thank you so much.
no, thank you for having me, Frank. It was a lot of fun.